Normally, I don't always look at games that have been out on a platform for a while, but there are exceptions that will pop up now and again. The biggest of those is when they come to other platforms, aka ports of games, and today is no exception. Vaporum releases on the PS4 on April 9th in the US, April 10th in the European Union, April 10th on the Xbox One, and April 11th on the Nintendo Switch. It is a grid-based dungeon crawler with RPG elements, and the game will cost $24.99 on most platforms, but it has been on Steam for a while now and is $19.99 on Steam. But before I begin this review, this key was obtained from evolve.pr for the purposes of review. That won't change my opinion of the game in the end, but you should know that because of FTC guidelines, as well as the whole morals thing, you know? And one final note, I used the Switch version of the game for this review, so any specifics to technical elements, I'm referring to the Switch version, unless if I'm making a direct comparison to another platform. One last thing, there's going to be this overlay at certain points of this video, and I want to apologize for that. With my Elgato setup, even though I hadn't clicked it to begin with, I must have accidentally clicked it while playing the game, and unfortunately it shows up in a good amount of footage here, at least towards the start of the game. Just keep in mind that that's not there while you're playing. You probably could figure that out, but it does sometimes blend into the background, at least a little bit too much. So, on with the review. So, I'll start with what will draw most people to give Vaporum a try, the gameplay. For those of you who don't know, Vaporum is a grid-based dungeon crawler with RPG elements, having you work through a series of hallways, traps, and enemies in order to make it further and further in the mysterious structure. The basics of the genre are here. You move slowly, tile by tile, and attack your enemies in a real-time system. You have a choice of weapons that you can equip with 2 easily changeable loadout slots, and you can dual wield if you so desire, although you'll need a skill to take the accuracy enhancer off. Weapons and armor are reasonably typical for the genre here. You have one-handed swords, daggers, one- and two-handed maces for melee options. Ranged weapons boil down to pistols, shotguns, and rifles, each with their own range and damage requirements. For one-handed weapons, you can get a nice shield to go to block the damage, and that includes the pistol, which I completely forgot until 33% of the way through the game that, oh wait, I could equip something in my other hand with the pistol. Armor gets broken down into your typical light, medium, and heavy type elements, with heavy providing more health and substance, while light usually gives you more energy to help to use your tech tree with. Speaking of which, you'll get 2 slots for tech items, which take inventory slots in the game, but are skills that you can use in battle. They range from elemental attacks like shocking elements, to fire elements, to poison element. Actually, that's about 50% of the skills right there. Now, there are other ones, but I mostly use the fast melee one and the take the enemy health one. You can get other skills, but I'm going to be honest here, some of them feel very similar to each other in the end. And yes, there's things like the shield, but as I am going to reveal, you're not going to get as much use out of that one as you may think. The combat has a huge focus on positioning and timing in the long haul of the game. Even with taking a majority of defensive options in my playthrough, the heavy rig, using shields, I found myself taking damage on a reasonable basis to the point where I would have to exploit the game's battle system. Although the game is designed like that, and other games like this have that system. What I mean by exploit is that while the game's combat is in real time, there is significant time for enemies to move and attack you. You can easily use this to your advantage, especially in 1v1 scenarios, as once you get the rhythm for this battling, you can time your attacks and movements to hit an enemy, move out of the range of their attacks without them even getting a chance to hurt you. The most obvious example of this is with stationary turrets, as you can easily move around them and get hits in regardless of the configuration on the battlefield. Now note, this isn't just about speed, but is about rhythm. If you go too fast in certain cases, you won't get the attack in, or the enemy will move while you move. Now, Vaporum takes this into account, and you do need to pay attention to the enemy, as they will change up their movement patterns every now and again, and given the time window, that can end up costing you. This type of combat does work well when there are multiple enemies, and the game becomes a chess match of putting yourself in the best spot to succeed. Sometimes, you may want to back yourself into a hallway so that you take on one enemy at a time. Sometimes, you'll keep moving and using ranged attacks to whittle down enemies, without getting flanked by multiple enemies and taking a lot more damage in the process. It's when you're first introduced to a new scenario of enemies and level design where the battle system is at its best. The problem with the structure of this combat, however, is that the exploitation of the movement system gets very old very quickly. Sure, level design does really help this, as you notice rooms with pillars causing unique challenges for you, especially with multiple enemies. But single enemies end up starting to feel like a chore over time, as you'll really want to just grin and bear it, and take the hits even though you want to save as much health as possible. You'll just stand there and smack them and smack them and smack them, and sure, you'll take some damage, but you know what? I just want to get through it. You don't really want to dance around towards the middle half and the 2/3 point of the game, but that's sort of the problem here. Health is a valuable resource in the game, and you will need to scratch and claw for it, especially at harder difficulties, so you really don't have a choice. It doesn't help that while there are rare drops and items that all are really found in secret areas, there's something about the loot system that just lacks oomph, which is made worse if you don't get the right route with skills. What I mean by that is, if you just so happen to find the wrong weapon in terms of that special secret area weapon, or you completely miss a treasure chest even though you're pretty sure that you went through every single part of the map, you may end up with a weapon and a skill set that just don't match. Now you may be saying to yourself, well, that can happen in any game, right? But weapons in particular here, especially with the skill bases, are significant enough where using a weapon that you may not have skills put into isn't that much of an increase over others, even though it's the next tier of weapon. And something about the balance, at least on my side, with these weapons, is a little bit off. It doesn't help that the weapon models, even for upgraded versions, are so similar to each other model-wise that you can't necessarily tell them apart at first glance. In fact, you have to use the tooltips. But with the Switch version's menus, you may end up accidentally equipping the lesser version of the weapon and not realize it, and then wonder why you're struggling to take down these new enemies. Unfortunately, the combat lacks oomph. The skills just feel like they are there to have a skill tree. The loot is there to have a loot tree. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is that things start to feel the same over time, and especially if you're playing for hours at a time. I will admit that this game is a lot better when you play 30 minutes here, 30 minutes there. But in particular with bosses, there's only one boss that really excited me in the end, and even that was pretty similar to things I had done before. Unfortunately, the game just lacked that killer instinct in terms of hitting you over the head with some feature within it that was really, really good, at least in the combat area. But there is another part to the gameplay here, and that's the exploration and navigation, and specifically dealing with puzzles and traps. Now, like the combat, there is a little bit of hit and miss here, but especially early on, there are simple puzzles that require a little bit of brain navigation. And then there are some puzzles that require a bit of timing and some manipulation that are reasonable and actually take some thought and execution to do without necessarily feeling too frustrating. This puzzle, for example, was an interesting one, where there would be a series of light balls that you had to stop them from hitting the wall, and then when two of them hit the wall at the same time, you're sitting there going, okay, how do I deal with this? And then you get past that one and a whole new element opens up in terms of, oh wait, now I got to do something else. This is where the puzzles and the exploration is at its best, when you don't necessarily die when you lose, and the little frustration factor builds, but doesn't feel that much. But, oh boy, when the game does misstep in these sections, it missteps in the worst of ways. Now look, to get the feeling of a true dungeon that's trying to kill you, of course there's going to be traps that linger in the hallways, and that you'll need to figure out how to move and stay alive to get around them, and be able to also identify them. Now sometimes it'll be a hidden button on the wall, or timing your movement right. And I get that. I should realize that a room with a gated off section in floor tiles probably has a reasonable chance to be a trap. Or a room being so reasonably large, despite the fact that I came in one side and there's only one other side and there's nothing else in this room, yeah, something doesn't seem right here. I know it's a trap, but I don't know what kind of trap it is. One note, unfortunately, the save file that I had to recreate some of the footage in order to get this section wasn't there. I ended up saving over it. And the thing is, the original footage got corrupted. So I'm working with halfway through the puzzle at this point, so keep that in mind while I recreate the scenario in question. Let's use this room as an example of where I have major issues with some of the game design elements of the game. So, at a first glance, nothing looks too bad right now, right? I mean, it's just an empty room. Okay, let's try to get out of this room. Oh, okay. Floor gives out and I die. So I have to find the button, right, to maybe stop the floor from giving out? I mean, that's where most of the other ones have been, so let me try that. Let me go and reload and try to find a button. Okay, there's no button here. I need to maybe turn on the slowing of time, because obviously if I try this again, it goes really, really fast. So maybe there's something I had noticed when I slow down time. Okay, maybe there's some kind of tile that's uniquely marked. No, nothing different here. Oh, what is the solution? Can you give me a hint? Okay, game, what do you want me to do? Wait, what was that? Oh, you're indicating which one to stand on tile-wise by the light. That lights for half a second. The core of this game design here of finding the right tile, getting on it, then finding the right next one, that's fine. But my big problem here is with the timing. Why only light the tile for a half a second? Even using the time slow mechanic here, the big problem is that if you're completely looking the other way when that tile lights up, you will not have a chance to be able to see it. And that means you're pretty much dead, especially if you're in the middle of the room and have a lot more options that it could be. The thing is, sure, I can save and reload, but puzzles should feel like you're overcoming them with your wit, not by cheesing the game's mechanics and especially cheesing the load system. I don't feel accomplished when doing this, and I have to ask the question, why not keep the light flickering a bit more until the floor gives way? I understand you wouldn't want to keep it lit the entire time because you want to have the player remember exactly which tile it's on, but this goes away so quickly that, frankly, I feel like the game is just giving me the middle finger more than anything else. It's my biggest complaint about the game, a reliance on the save system and knowing what's coming. In my opinion, your impact on the game can be somewhat minimal at times in the first time you run through an area. You can end up getting flanked by multiple poisonous enemies, for example, and the thing is, you never saw that one poisonous enemy spawn, and you just need to know that before you enter the room. only with that knowledge going into that room will you be okay, and that's the problem, because then when you do it, it feels more like a chore. If I'm a dungeon crawler and an adventurer, I want to feel like it was me who got past the challenge. Now you may be saying to yourself, Dragnix, it sounds like you just suck at these type of games. And full disclosure, that may be a possibility. I mean, take a look at my Stranger of Sword City review. But the thing is that the skills that it's trying to test, being observant, being able to get through a situation through a pattern manipulation, or being able to use your enemy's movement patterns against them, that's things I'm very usually good at. And so for it not to work here and have me load and save over and over again, I'm going to lean towards the game design more than anything else being at fault here. Especially when I see on the forums for the Steam version that it almost feels like that's part of the design from the developer team. One of my other complaints that's directly tied to that is the game's use of mouse controls for certain parts, or what was obviously mouse-controlled elements from the Steam version. Now, the Switch version allows for a control scheme using the right bumper and the movement of an analog stick to be able to drag things or to be able to touch certain things on screen. But it's slow, and even though you do get an option to control the speed in the options menu, it just becomes a slight problem depending on the distance from the item you need to click, and some of the things that you have to do are time challenges, so it makes a difference. Now granted, this isn't a problem if you use one of the mechanics in the game, but that mechanic, well, let's just talk about it now. The time slow mechanic. Basically, you can slow down time at any point, allowing you to almost turn the game into a turn-based element of sorts. Some challenges require this, because you'll need all the speed and time to get through it by the hair of your chinny chin chin. But I'm going to be honest here, it's a chore to use this. It especially feels like that when I get an audio log during a section of it, and it's like the game is punishing me for using the time element because it's stopping the playing of the audio log if I'm not moving. So it's like, oh, you want to hear all this? Well, you better keep moving. Oh, but you can't keep moving because you got to make sure that all these elements are going towards you. It really felt like the tool itself was used to make challenges easier and that it wasn't in the design to begin with. I have no proof of that, and honestly, that doesn't seem like it would be something that the developers would do, but I will admit, I wish this didn't exist in the game and the puzzles were just adjusted accordingly. Overall, hit and miss on the gameplay section for Vaporum. While I had a lot of complaints about the execution of the gameplay, I can't necessarily make the same claims about the game's story. In fact, it's reasonably well done. The story starts as our main protagonist wakes up in the middle of rocky waters, unaware of who he is, and finding himself in front of a large metallic obelisk. Having really nothing else to do at that point, our main protagonist eventually enters it, finding a structure of steel mazes, chemically enhanced processes, and various other tech that you would find present in a steampunk world. The world built here is an interesting one. As you'll learn, this obelisk is home to a community that's here to research, build, and do what you would expect a thriving economy and society would do: push progress to its absolute limit. Of course, with any story like this, you can guess that things don't exactly go to plan, as you'll find the research station overrun with helper drones gone rogue, mysterious acting enemies, and for some reason giant mutated cockroaches that spit poison at you. A good amount of the storytelling here is divided into narration from our main protagonist and audio-visual logs that you run across, with minimal cutscenes here and there. But despite that, which is usually something that I don't necessarily like, what I do like is the storytelling is focused on the characters within this world, which is actually very, very uncommon when it comes to these audio-visual logs. Now, I understand it comes from a character in most cases in terms of other games, But here, the audio logs start off enough to give major players in this world context to their personality, and the voices give a lot of that personality as well. They indicate what role they play in the story, and it makes you want to follow their thread by finding the next segment. They feel distinct, they feel like individuals, and they don't feel like someone who's just going to be thrown away for the sake of plot. There is a reason for each sub-story to be finished here. Now, it's true that some of the themes you would expect in a story about a person with amnesia in a future dystopian setting are here. That being said, I found the twists that the game pulled on you were enough to make this version of the story stand out. You will go through levels of sympathy, anger, and the detective nature of trying to fill in the blanks here is done well, by pacing out the information that's given to you and rewarding exploration into the environment, finding that next audio log or that next visual log. I have to reiterate, however, the game will force you to earn your story, especially with reading the lore. So if that doesn't sound like your jam, you're probably not going to like Vaporum's story. There's good twists here with our main character, and you do get attached to him and what he ends up going through. He's not the star of the show per se, but I liked who they chose to follow here, without giving any spoilers to the story itself, of course. Good writing, but not great, but a lot more than I expected with a dungeon crawler of this type. I also like that the actual research element comes into play here, and there's actual building of the world and the materials in it. You get background of the enemies you fought and what they do, and you end up understanding why fumium, this element that powers everything around you, is so coveted, and what it ends up meaning in this world. So overall, the story surprised me, and while it's not anything to write home about, it is probably the strongest element of the game. But it still lacks in certain areas. Moving on. The steampunk aesthetic takes center stage in the game's presentation, and I'm still having real trouble whether I like this presentation or not. The game most assuredly captures the core of a steampunk world from the get-go. There's a layer of grunge and dirt in these metal hallways, with having enemies and bots show a functional style of design without breaking the mold of a dystopian future or going way too over the top. There's a good mixture of the different styles of floors, each having specific purposes within the structure, such as waterworks or a library. It does do an okay job of making them unique enough to stand out for that level with the use of color and specific features, but there are some reused elements with bedding quarters that can feel out of place at times. I mean, I understand that some people like to read, but a room in the library? Granted, some of the texture qualities of some of the pieces can also be a little iffy, especially within some of the walls, but it doesn't distract too much from the game. But what lacks here is personality. Here's the thing, you needed some more assets to really give some personality to this place, especially in the rooms. I understand that there is a certain element to this dystopian world, this, future where people are building things and researching and everything, but that doesn't mean these people are stripped of anything, and it really doesn't necessarily make the location stand out to you as much as I think they should be. Granted, some of the locations with more unique structures do stand out, and make you stop and admire them for a second or two, especially when you get to the missions where you have to melt down steel, or fumium is used in piping. The best part is probably the lighting work as a whole in the environment in relation to its own self, as the glow can be attractive in certain ways, making you feel like a moth to a light. However, the sound design is probably the best part of the presentation as a whole, as the sounds of gears moving, or the slamming of metal against other metal as pistons fire off, really help to build the world and help make you feel a part of it. Gunfire may be basic, but gives you some oomph to your attacks that, frankly, the damage doesn't necessarily do. And there's something about the world being haunting when there's no music playing, and just listening to the creaks and the strain of the world that is taking place, the sounds of flames coming out of pipes or steam rushing forward, makes a huge difference in terms of immersion. Granted, sometimes you may seem to miss sound that's behind you once in a while, but regardless, take a listen and listen to what I think is some reasonable sound design. As for music, it really only happens in certain areas of the game, usually related to combat, and while it can ramp up the feeling of action that happens in these sections, it isn't exactly going to take home any awards of any sort. It's used to push up tension in those battle sequences, but the game wants the atmosphere of the world to dictate otherwise. Not memorable in a lot of ways, still, take a listen to hear what I'm talking about. Finally, the voice acting is actually really good in my opinion. It's on par with the sound design. Characters' personalities come through strongly with these characters, and there's good progression of character traits throughout the game for key players. Granted, I do remember one line here and there that were flubbed, but overall, most of the actors capture the moment and the emotion they're going for, at least in the English voice acting. Listen and judge for yourself.
Years of Thumium research. I can certainly say it's a lot more intriguing than we ever thought. We must give the research all we can. I keep asking Marcus to assign more people to my research, and to ask the Bureau for more scientists too. I'm having fits of anger every other day because of all this inept personnel. We have had 2 serious accidents already because the dumb dabblers can't work safely and rigorously under pressure, like me. Look, I'm raising a child and still leading the research. To top it off, Marcus is putting his nose in things now, asking this and that, and this only slows down my progress. He just can't possibly conceive why it's so important to put every single resource we've got solely into my research.
Early this morning, I met Lucy Page on the balcony again. She was so nervous, constantly looking around, as if she was afraid that somebody might have overheard what she was about to whisper. Man, what whining! Laura this, Laura that. She's inexperienced, she's neglectful, she's evil. What's wrong with this old hag? Laura is a bright, outstanding scientist. She understands the project's priorities, and unlike some others, she's willing to make sacrifices. Everybody should. Progress can't be stopped.
Overall, the presentation, especially for a Switch game, does have some stumbles, but honestly, it works, and it works really well to capture the feelings that it's going for, the atmosphere, and to drive the story home. Finally, let me wrap up this review by talking a tiny bit about the technical elements of the game. For a reminder, I played the game on the Nintendo Switch, and the game seems to run at 60 FPS with a 1080p resolution. But sometimes it's sorta hard to notice that, considering the gameplay style. I did experience no memorable frame drops, however, in the docked mode, other than right before a stairwell and a loading screen. But in undocked mode, I did see hiccups every now and again. They weren't enough to really hurt the overall experience, however. For a Switch title, however, I was surprised at the amount of options available to me. Granted, it does help it came from the PC, but things like gamma correction and anti-alias sharpening did help when switching from the TV to the undocked version of the game. And you do have a bunch of options with over 8 languages here, difficulty, screen shake and damage numbers, and various other options that you see on screen here. Pretty good overall, and in addition, there were no crashes at all during my experience, so that's a huge plus. Not everything, though, here is great. My biggest complaint, technically, is one that drove me insane throughout the game. This button right here. Load last save. It's only true about 5% of the time. See, it does load the last save. The last autosave. Meaning that every time you get to this screen, you have to tell that part of your brain that goes, oh, right, I just want to load the last save. Maybe I should press it. Because no, that's completely wrong. You have to throw that out. It doesn't help that when you actually have to go load the actual last save file, the game doesn't have options to organize the save files by timestamps or anything. So finding the exact one I want can be a hassle, especially if I accidentally saved in the wrong spot, and now I've got a couple of copies all over the place. The interface isn't exactly built for that. Remember what I said in the gameplay section too. The fact of the matter is, you will be using the load save button a lot in this game due to its design. And so, for this to sort of still be there, yeah, I am a little bit frustrated by it. Especially when it was around the 2/3 mark of the game when I was running into those traps. Yeah, I was getting frustrated to the point where I walked away on 2 separate occasions. Overall, the one blemish on the game technically is big, but the performance and options are here and help the game a bit. But only a bit. In the end, while I appreciated aspects of the storytelling here, and the steampunk theme is something I loved on the surface in its implementation, Vaporum's inability to keep me entertained over the long haul was what ended up tripping up the game for me. Don't get me wrong, the game does have good gameplay elements in some of the enemy variety that required some different strategies against it, and there were elements of the gameplay's timing of attacks that really worked for me. In short bursts, the game was reasonable, but over the long haul, the real lack of oomph of your abilities, the loot feeling like it was there to just be there, and an over-reliance on precognition in certain areas ended up putting up walls that hurt the game's pacing. Some design decisions here were downright confusing, and the game's hiccups ended up pushing my frustration through the roof, and not a good frustration. Not a Dark Souls-like frustration. It's definitely a niche game that has an audience for it, but based on what I see, Vaporum comes in at a 65 out of 100, making it a sale buy for most players. That does not include my enhancer system, however, which takes the more subjective elements of games and puts score enhancers based on unique attributes for the player. If you strongly fall into one of the following categories, add or subtract that score to the main score. If the first digit of your score changes, follow this chart to determine where the game's buyability rating rests for you. Coming up next on the channel video-wise is a review of the sequel to one of the highest games rated on Steam, One Finger Death Punch 2. I'll also be starting my Zanki Zero review, but as I didn't get a review copy, you all should know that it will take some time on that one. It is a dungeon crawling RPG, of course. And the fact that it's by the Danganronpa guys, yeah, I'm going to be looking forward to playing that. Until then, leave your feedback on the video and what I can improve in the comments section below. and join the Discord in the description below to interact with the community and get more detailed information, shoot the shit about other games, food, and random discussions that happen. Until next time, this is Dragnix signing out, and as always, keep on gaming.